Percent financial, percent job,
Financial job.
Financial job, financial.
Thank you, financial. Thank you.
Job, percent, job, percent, financial job, percent, financial percent, percent,
Financial.
tax, financial,
Financial percent.
Thank
financial job,
Thank you.
financial
to the job, financial job,
percent, financial.
Thank percent job,
Financial percent.
Thank you. Financial. Thank you. Percent. Job. Percent.
job,
Financial.
thank financial,
Driven. Thank you.
Thank percent.
thank percent, thank
Thank financial. Thank
Percent.
thank financial
Percent.
percent and percent,
Thank percent. Thank job.
Thank percent.
percent.
Percenting percent. Thank percent.
Thank present, thank
job, financial,
Thank percent.
Thank percent.
and then font 2%. Thank job,
Financial, international.
thank financial
Job. Percent. Financial. Thank you.
Thank financial
Job.
financial percent
job,
percent
financial percent.
Thank financial.
Thank
thank you, Chairman.
process.
Thank